Our next speaker is Dr. David Osher, Vice President and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. His work focuses on school climate and the conditions for learning and social emotional learning. We're so grateful to have David on our panel today to share his research on creating safe, supportive learning environments.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Catherine, and also thank you very, very much, Phyllis, as well. I think you really set the stage very, very well for what we're talking about, and the CDC has and continues to do extraordinarily important work in this area. Next slide, please. My work with others over the past half decade has really focused on the ongoing interactions between what's happening within individuals and between individuals in environments, and how that both contributes to both thriving on the one hand, including well-being, and on the other hand, how it also contributes to ill-being. And the framing I'm going to give here comes from that. There are resources on the second page of the resources about the science of learning development and the syntheses that we've done that will provide the scientific basis for this work that is not just done by me, but with a whole set of other people as well. I think the key here is that individuals can thrive or languish across dynamically interdependent individual and collective ecosystems. And thriving and well-being are not just individual, they're collective. They're not just objectively things that we can measure, they're also subjective. They're not just in any one domain, they occur across all life domains, and those domains coact. And they're in all parts of every child's and every adult's life spaces. And in those spaces, the experiences people have, the relationships they have between and among each other and environments shape how adults and children interact and develop. And this also shapes what we know about what contributes to resilience or ill-being. When a parent or a teacher is under stress, they're less likely to be able to support a child who's under stress or who's experienced trauma than the opposite. And it's very important to understand that when we think about intervention, because the child is an important target, but she or he is not the only target. And what also affects things is both among children and adults, the interrelated cognitive, emotional, and cognitive capacities that people have and affect themselves. And cognitive capacity, for example, is not your basic intelligence level. It's your bandwidth. Can you do something or can you not do something? When you're working 3 jobs, it's much harder. When you're having more kids than you can handle, it's much harder. These capacities are affected by the conditions around people. We can help adults, we can help young people succeed and thrive and be resilient, or the opposite, or they can be undermined. And relationships, as I said, between people, the process of meaning making that they make individually and collectively, the effects of stress drive growth and development, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. When it's toxic stress, it's going to be a bad thing. And the historical context matters. The issues of the expanded ACEs always existed. It's just the fact that the initial Kaiser Permanente database tended to be very, very middle class and didn't pick up what we know has existed. We now know it, and it's very, very real. And the current social conflicts as well heighten these issues. Next slide, please. You may want to look at this document. There's a lead afterwards, but I'm here. It's here because of the fact that I want you to think about just this model for a second. And it's that dynamism is important. And while this talks about how we can build success, think about reversing it. It's also how we can create ill-being and a cascade of negative coactions and interactions and outcomes. Next slide, please. We now know, and the science of learning development syntheses that I and others have done really further establish it, that ACEs are not destiny. You know, when I adopted my children and who had experienced a bunch of ACEs, the people I was working with really tried to say to me, at best, what you could do is prosthetics. This is 30 years ago. We now know that we can do a lot better than prosthetics. We now know a great deal about the promise of neuroplasticity. And what we also know, and I know from other work that I do and other people do, about the profound human capacity to learn. Now, we also know there's a profound capacity to learn good things. There's also a profound capacity to learn silly things. But the brain can heal and grow. People can learn and change. Resilience, personal growth, and even thriving are possible for everybody. But we have to create the safe and supportive environments to enable it to happen. We have to create, adapt, and support adaptable, caring relationships between adults and peers, siblings. We have to build around young people and adults ecological assets. And when we do this, we can create those three components of thriving that you can read about if you look at that report. The floor of thriving, which is incredibly important, is well-being. But thriving also includes a sense of groundedness, knowing where you are in time and place, feeling that you're connected to other people, and a sense of individual and collective agency, that I can do something about it. You all know the word S and then blank happens. Agency is about the fact that that might be happening, but I can do something about it, and we can do something about it. And that becomes really important when we think later on about trauma-related interventions. Next slide, please. Catherine laid it out, in terms of the variety of ACEs. I just want to point out again that these things really will connect very deeply in all sorts of different ways. You can look at the slide at some other point. Next slide, please. And we can think about the conditions that perpetuate adversity and trauma. And remember that downward dynamic that I suggested as well. Trauma, toxic stress, complex stress, multiple and cascading traumas. Not just an individuals, but connection between them. A traditional ACE is having a parent who's been arrested. Think about that ACE within the context of historical racism and institutionalized racism, and the experience of Black people with mass incarceration, and understanding when a policeman comes in and arrests a Black person more than a white person, that's not just an ACE coming out, it's multiple different things that can co-act. There's also the possibility, and institutions do them all the time, of re-traumatization. There's negative learning. People always learn. And there's the amplification of ill-being. And this happens by reversing all the good things I talked about before, by creating threatening and unsupportive environments, by using harmful interventions and building ecological risks, and using harsh, punitive, uncaring, unsupportive approaches when we interact with other people. I think Catherine really talked about the extent to which ACEs really affect young people in the short and long run. I'll just say that in addition, it affects issues of hope. It can affect your sense of connection and efficacy in the world. Next slide. This comes from my colleagues at the Center for the Developing Child, who are part of the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, and it really just reflects some of the things that Catherine talked about. I will not elaborate now, so we can go to the next slide. And this slide also reflects the fact that we don't want to just be thinking about the individual, even though the individual is key. We have to think about those relationships, and we have to think about how those are nested in communities and workplaces, including the inter-coaction between those different parts of a person's ecology, and then the effects of large social policy. And we have seen all of those play out in the last 2 years in terms of COVID, in terms of the racial conflict and so forth, and how it occurs within segregated communities and how it's experienced differently with different levels of adversity. Next slide, please. The key message here, besides focusing on adults as well as on young people, is that support is the key facilitator of healing, of growth, and of change. And for that to happen, adults as well as peers and siblings need the support so that they can attune to each other and to a troubling child or a troubled child, to provide emotional support and buffer stress, to be culturally humble and competent and responsive and learn from others and listen and be empathic, to support people's social, cognitive, and emotional development, to provide both instrumental support, but also provide the relational support that is even as key, if not more key. And as I said before, stress, fear, and cognitive overload and a lack of empathy undermine the ability to provide support. We know that teachers or policemen who actually may know about implicit bias are less likely to be able to handle that when they're under stress and under high levels of bandwidth challenge. And then they go back to a default system that involves implicit biases and the traditional tools that they learn to handle. Next slide, please. Why should schools and other service settings address trauma? Because they won't realize their goals unless they're able to. And I won't talk about it here, but I think there really is a reason, not just in terms of the needs of young people and families, but also in the needs of the institutions to really collaborate and coordinate and create a trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed system. Next slide, please. And what I want to say to you is that we both want to create trauma-sensitive places that include the ability to provide trauma-informed, more intensive interventions. And we also want to make sure that those approaches are equity-centered and centered on healing and centered on creating the conditions in the long run and not just the short run where people are more able to thrive and more able to prevent the causes of ill-being. And if you look at some of the references on the right side, and I particularly would refer you to the really important work by Sean Ginwright, who's at the University of California, San Francisco, on his approach to dealing with community trauma, which I think is extraordinarily important and suggestive. Next slide, please. I talked about trauma sensitivity and trauma informed. And this is for schools as an example, because I do a lot of work in schools, but I also do, and my colleagues doing a lot of work in other agencies. And just to know that what we need to be doing is to really not just focus on those people who we know have been traumatized. We can't ignore that in any way. We also have to know that both the people who we may not have seen or screened for trauma may actually have experienced it, but also they do things or don't do things that will affect other people in the environment. Next slide, please. Let me just talk for a second about the difference between a traditional environment and a trauma-sensitive environment. On the one hand, traditional environments, which are much less aware of the implications of trauma and how it affects behavior of children and adults, tend to be judgmental rather than trying to figure out what's going on for the young person and what can we do. The focus is on fixing individuals rather than creating a supportive environment that can help individuals heal and also prevent what's happening. A focus often in institutions and settings ends up being on management, on power, on obedience, and through control rather than power through collaboration, through people's ability to manage their own emotions. Traditional environments tend to be more reactive and punitive. Good trauma-sensitive environments are proactive and restorative. Traditional trauma environments are often siloed, and they see children that the exposure to trauma as being just isolated, whereas trauma-sensitive environments are much more integrated, and traditional environments tend to be more deficit-oriented. Trauma-sensitive environments more strength-based. Next slide. Let me just say that a key element is not just educating all staff on its effects and providing physically, emotionally, and identity safe environments, but also eliminating the harmful iatrogenic things that are often done: corporal punishment, restraint, suspension, disproportionate surveillance and harshness of responses, implicit and explicit bias, racial and cultural neutrality, school hardening policies that affect all children who have really experienced trauma and are dealing with it, but particularly minoritized and marginalized children. Next slide, please. And I'm going to now end it because I'm at my end. Just know that safety is not just physical, and it's also emotional, psychological, and involves identity, among other things. Next slide. I've talked about this, so let's go to the next slide right now. And I just want you to know that what we really want is also not just to think about, I would suggest, trauma sensitivity, but really using transformative approaches that in the way in which we help people heal, we build individual and collective agency on the right. That's it's in blue. And that we do things that really build the way in which people can individually, collectively, both deal with things that have happened to them, but also prevent it from happening to them and others later on, which in its own right ends up being healing. And let me go to the next slide. And just to end this, I just want to say, and I'm just taking two very important chemicals that relate to our HPA system. One is oxytocin. As you know, it's something that really bonds us. The other is cortisol. It's one of the stress hormones. What we really want is to create in environments, whether it's in families or schools or agencies, whether it's among peers or adults, the flowing of oxytocin, which bounds but also is healing and actually helps people learn better. And we want to minimize the level of cortisol that really, when it's at a high level, is highly problematic. The following slides have a bunch of resources. I thank you very, very much. I'm happy to be available to you, and I pass it back to Catherine.
Thank you so much, David.